The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 1. The stranger came early in February, one wintry day, walking from Bramblehurst railway station, and carrying a little black portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat hid every inch of his face but the shiny tip of his nose. He staggered into the coach and horses, and flung his portmanteau down. "A fire!" he cried. "A room and a fire!" He followed Mrs. Hall into her guest parlor to strike his bargain, and soon he took up his quarters in the inn. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and left him there while she went to prepare him a meal. As soon as the bacon was well under way, she carried the cloth, plates, and glasses into the parlor and began to lay them before him. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir?" she said, "and give them a good dry in the kitchen?" "No," he said, turning to her. "I prefer to keep them on." Then she noticed that he wore big blue spectacles with sidelights, and had a bush side whisker over his coat collar that completely hid his cheeks and face. "Very well, sir," she said. Mrs. Hall laid the rest of the items on the table and whisked out of the room. When she returned, he was still standing there, his collar turned up, his dripping hat brim turned down. She put down the eggs and bacon and said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he said, and did not stir until she was closing the door. Then he swung round and approached the table with a certain eager quickness. As she entered the kitchen, she realized that she had forgotten the mustard, and so she filled the mustard pot and, putting it upon tray, carried it into the parlor. She rapped then and entered promptly. As she did so, her visitor moved quickly, so that she got but a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It would seem he was picking something from the floor. She noticed the overcoat and hat had been taken off and put over a chair in front of the fire, along with a pair of wet boots. "I suppose I may have them to dry now," she said resolutely. "Leave the hat," said the visitor, and turning, she saw he had raised his head and was looking at her. For a moment she stood gaping at him, too surprised to speak. He held a white cloth over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaws were completely hidden. His entire forehead above his blue glasses was covered by a white bandage, and another covered his ears, leaving not a scrap of his face exposed, excepting only his pink, peaked nose. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high linen-lined collar turned up about his neck. The thick black hair, escaping as it could below and between the cross bandages, giving him the strangest appearance conceivable. She placed the hat on the chair again by the fire. "I didn't know, sir," she began, "that—" and she stopped, embarrassed. "Thank you," he said dryly. "I'll have them nicely dried, sir, at once," she said, and carried his clothes out of the room. "The poor soul's had an accident, or an operation, or something," said Mrs. Hall. "What a turn them bandages did give me, to be sure! And holding that handkerchief over his mouth all the time. Perhaps his mouth was hurt, too." When Mrs. Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, he sat in the corner with his back to the window blind. "I have some luggage," he said, "at Bramblehurst station," and he asked her how he could have it sent. He bowed his head politely in acknowledgment of her explanation. "Tomorrow?" he said. "There is no speedier delivery?" and seemed quite disappointed when she answered, "No." "Thanks," he said concisely, then turned and stared out of the window. "I should explain," he added, "what I was too cold and fatigued to do before, that I am an experimental investigator." "Indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "and my baggage contains apparatus and appliances, and I'm very naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries." "Of course, sir." "I do not wish to be disturbed in my work," he added. "In addition to my work, an accident—" "I thought as much," said Mrs. Hall to herself, "necessitates a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful that I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours together. At such times the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well these things should be understood." The visitor remained in the parlor until 4 o'clock without giving the ghost of an excuse for an intrusion. Chapter 2. Next day the stranger's luggage arrived. There were a couple of trunks, such as a rational man might need. In addition, there were a box of books and a dozen or more crates, boxes, and cases containing objects packed in straw. The stranger, muffled in hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet the cart. "Come along with those boxes," he said. "I've been waiting long enough." As soon as the first crate was carried into the parlor, the stranger flung himself upon it with extraordinary eagerness and began to unpack it. and from it he began to produce bottles of all kinds, putting them in rows on the chiffonier, on the mantel, on the table under the window, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The only things that came out of these crates besides the bottles were a number of test tubes and a carefully packed balance. Immediately the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, nor for the other luggage that had been delivered. When Mrs. Hall took his dinner in to him, he was so absorbed in his work that he did not hear her until she had swept away the bulk of the straw and put the tray on the table. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned it away again. But she saw he had removed his glasses. It seemed to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put on his spectacles again and then turned and faced her. "I wish you wouldn't come in without knocking," he said in an exasperated tone. "I knocked, but seemingly—" "The slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must ask you—" "Certainly, sir. You can turn the lock, you know, any time." "A very good idea," said the stranger. All the afternoon he worked with the door locked, and once there was a sound of bottles ringing together and the smash of a bottle flung violently down. Fearing something was the matter, she went to the door and listened, not caring to knock. "I can't go on," he was raving. "All my life it may take me. Fool! Fool!" Later, when she took in his tea, she saw broken glass in the corner of the room and a stain that had been carelessly wiped. She called attention to it. "For God's sake, don't worry me," snapped her visitor. "If there's damage done, add it to the bill." Chapter 3. The stranger worked very fitfully, and his temper continued very uncertain. He seemed under a chronic irritation of the greatest intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him. He rarely went abroad by daylight, but at twilight he would go out muffled up invisibly, choosing always the loneliest paths. It was inevitable that a person of so remarkable an appearance and bearing should form a frequent topic in such a village as Iping. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Mrs. Hall was sensitive on the point, explained very carefully that he was an experimental investigator. But whatever they thought of him, people in Iping agreed in disliking him. His irritability was an amazing thing to these quiet Sussex villagers. The headlong pace after nightfall that swept him upon them round quiet corners, the pulling down of blinds, the extinction of candles and lamps, who could agree with such goings-on? Then came the burglary at the vicarage. It occurred in the small hours of Whit Monday, the day devoted in Iping to the club festivities. Mrs. Bunting woke up with the strong impression that the door of their bedroom had opened and closed. She then distinctly heard the pad of bare feet coming out of the adjoining dressing-room and walking along the passage towards the staircase. She aroused the Reverend Bunting as quietly as possible. He went out on the landing to listen, and quite distinctly heard a fumbling going on at his study desk downstairs, and then a violent sneeze. At that he returned to his bedroom, armed himself with the poker, and descended the staircase as noiselessly as possible. Everything was still except the faint creaking of the stairs under Mr. Bunting's tread and the slight movements in the study. Then a match was struck, and the study was flooded with yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack of the door he could see the desk and the open drawer and a candle burning on the desk. But the robber he could not see. He stood there in the hall, undecided what to do, and Mrs. Bunting crept slowly downstairs after him. They heard the chink of money and realized that the robber had found the housekeeping reserve of gold. At that sound, Mr. Bunting rushed into the room, closely followed by Mrs. Bunting. "Surrender!" cried Mr. Bunting, and then stopped, amazed. The room was perfectly empty. "I could have sworn," said Mr. Bunting. "The candle," said Mrs. Bunting. "Who lit the candle?" "The drawer," said Mrs. Bunting. "And the money's gone." There was a violent sneeze in the passage. They rushed out, and as they did so, the kitchen door slammed. They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw through the scullery that the back door was just opening. He is certain that nothing went out of the door. It opened, stood open for a moment, and then closed with a slam. When they entered the kitchen, no one was there. They refastened the back door, examined the kitchen, pantry, and scullery thoroughly, and at last went down into the cellar. There was not a soul to be found in the house. Chapter 4. Now it happened that in the early hours of that morning, Mr. Hall and Mrs. Hall both rose and went down into the cellar. Their business there was of a private nature, and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. They had hardly entered the cellar when Mrs. Hall found she had forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room. Mr. Hall went upstairs to retrieve it, and, on the landing, he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. He went on into his own room and found the bottle as he had been directed. But returning with the bottle, he noticed that the bolts of the front door had been shot back. At the sight he stopped, gaping, then, with the bottle still in his hand, went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door. There was no answer, so he pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he expected. The room was empty, and on the bedroom chair were scattered the garments and the bandages of their guest. At that discovery, he turned and hurried down to Mrs. Hall. "Jenny," he said, over the rail of the cellar steps, "he's not in his room, he ain't, and the front door's unbolted." At first, Mrs. Hall did not understand, and as soon as she did, she resolved to see the empty room for herself. Hall, still holding the bottle, went first. "If he ain't there," he said, "his clothes are. And what's he doing without his clothes, then?" As they came up the cellar steps, they both fancied they heard the front door open and shut, but seeing it closed and nothing there, neither said a word. Mrs. Hall passed her husband in the passage and ran on first upstairs. She flung open the door and stood regarding the room. "Of all the curious," she said. She bent forward and put her hand on the pillow and then under the clothes. "Cold," she said. "He's been up this hour or more." As she said this, the bedclothes gathered themselves together, leapt up suddenly into a sort of peak, and then jumped headlong over the bottom rail. Immediately after, the stranger's hat hopped off the bedpost, described a whirling flight in the air through the better part of a circle, and then dashed straight at Mrs. Hall's face. Then the chair, flinging the stranger's coat and trousers carelessly aside, turned itself up with its four legs at Mrs. Hall and charged at her. She screamed and turned, and then the chair legs came gently but firmly against her back and impelled her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed violently and was locked, and then everything was still. Mrs. Hall was left almost in a fainting condition in Mr. Hall's arms. It was with the greatest difficulty that Mr. Hall succeeded in getting her downstairs. "'Tats spirits," said Mrs. Hall. "I've read in papers of 'em. Tables and chairs leaping and dancing." "Lock him out," said Mrs. Hall. "Don't let him come in again. I half guessed. I might 'a' known. With them goggling eyes and bandaged head, and all they bottles. He's put the spirits into the furniture. My good old furniture." They went across the street to rouse up Mr. Sandy Wodgers, the blacksmith. He took quite a grave view of the case. "I'm darned if that ain't witchcraft." Then Mr. Huckster came outside and began taking down the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion. "Let's have the facts first," insisted Mr. Sandy Wodgers. "Let's be sure we'd be acting perfectly right in busting that there door open." Then suddenly the door of the room upstairs opened of its own accord, and as they looked up, they saw descending the stairs the muffled figure of the stranger, with those unreasonably large blue glass eyes of his. He walked across the passage staring, then stopped. "Look there," he said, and their eyes followed the direction of his gloved finger and saw a bottle of sarsaparilla hard by the cellar door. Then he entered the parlor and suddenly and viciously slammed the door in their faces. Chapter 5. The stranger went into the little parlor about 5:30, and there he remained until midday, the blinds down, the door shut, and none venturing near him. All that time he must have fasted. Thrice he rang his bell, but no one answered him. Presently came an imperfect rumor of the burglary at the vicarage, and 2 and 2 were put together. Hall, assisted by Wodgers, went off to find Mr. Shuckleforth, the magistrate, and take his advice. No one ventured upstairs. How the stranger occupied himself is unknown. Now and then he would stride violently up and down, and twice came an outburst of curses and a violent smashing of bottles. The little group of scared but curious people increased. Mr. Huckster came over. Some young fellows resplendent in black ready-made jackets and pique paper ties joined the group. About noon he suddenly opened his parlor door and stood glaring fixedly at the 3 or 4 people in the bar. "Mrs. Hall," he said. Somebody went and called for Mrs. Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared after an interval, a little short of breath, but all the fiercer for that. Hall was still out. She had deliberated over this scene, and she came holding a little tray with an unsettled bill upon it. "Why haven't you prepared my meals and answered my bell? Do you think I live without eating?" "Why isn't my bill paid?" said Mrs. Hall. "That's what I want to know." I told you 3 days ago I was awaiting a remittance. I told you 2 days ago I wasn't going to await no remittances. You can't grumble if your breakfast waits a bit, if my bill's been waiting these 5 days, can you?" The stranger swore briefly but vividly. "And I'd thank you kindly, sir, if you'd keep your swearing to yourself," said Mrs. Hall. "Look here, my good woman, I've told you my remittance hasn't come." "Remittance indeed," said Mrs. Hall. "Still, I dare say in my pocket. You told me 3 days ago that you hadn't anything but a sovereign's worth of silver upon you. Well, I've found some more. I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. That seemed to annoy the stranger very much. He stamped his foot. "What do you mean?" he said. "That I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. "And before I get any breakfasts or do any such things whatsoever, you got to tell me 1 or 2 things I don't understand. I want to know what you've been doing to my chair upstairs, and I want to know how 'tis your room was empty and how you got in again." Suddenly the stranger raised his gloved hands, stamped his foot, and said, "Stop!" with such extraordinary violence that he silenced her instantly. "You don't understand," he said, "who I am or what I am. I'll show you. By heaven, I'll show you." Then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a black cavity. "Here," he said. He stepped forward and handed Mrs. Hall something which she, staring at his metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose! It was the stranger's nose! Then he removed his spectacles, and everyone in the bar gasped. He took off his hat, and with a violent gesture tore at his whiskers and bandages. Mrs. Hall, standing open-mouthed and horror-struck, shrieked at what she saw, and made for the door of the house. Everyone began to move. Everyone tumbled on everyone else down the steps. For the man who stood there shouting some incoherent explanation was a solid, gesticulating figure up to the coat collar of him, and then nothingness, no visible thing at all. People down in the village heard shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street saw the coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. They saw Mrs. Hall fall down, and Mr. Teddy Henfrey jump to avoid tumbling over her. Very quickly, a crowd of perhaps 40 people hooted and inquired and exclaimed and suggested in front of Mrs. Hall's establishment. There was a disturbance behind, and the crowd stepped aside for a little procession that was marching very resolutely towards the house. First Mr. Hall, then Mr. Bobby Jaffers, the village constable, and then Mr. Wodgers. They had come now armed with a warrant. People shouted conflicting information of the recent circumstances. Mr. Hall marched straight to the door of the parlor and flung it open. "Constable," he said, "do your duty." Jaffers marched in, Hall next, Wodgers last. They saw in the dim light the headless figure facing them, with a gnawed crust of bread in one gloved hand and a chunk of cheese in the other. "That's him," said Hall. "What the devil's this?" came in a tone of angry expostulation from above the collar of the figure. "You're a damned rum customer, mister," said Mr. Jaffers. "But Ed or no Ed, the warrant says body, and duty's duty." "Keep off," said the figure. Off came the stranger's left glove and was slapped in Jaffers' face. In another moment, Jaffers had gripped him by the handless wrist and caught his invisible throat. He got a sounding kick on the shin that made him shout, but he kept his grip. Jaffers and the stranger swayed and staggered, clutching and hitting. A chair stood in the way and went aside with a crash as they came down together. "Get the feet," said Jaffers. Mr. Hall received a sounding kick in the ribs that disposed of him for a moment, and Mr. Wodgers, seeing the decapitated stranger had rolled over and got the upper side of Jaffers, retreated towards the door, and so collided with Mr. Huckster and the Sidderbridge carter coming to the rescue. At the same moment, down came 3 or 4 bottles from the chiffonier and shot a web of pungency into the air of the room. "I'll surrender," cried the stranger, though he had Jaffers down, and in another moment he stood up, panting, headless and handless, for he had pulled off his right glove now as well as his left. "It's no good," he said, as if sobbing for breath. Jaffers got up and produced a pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. "I say," said Jaffers, "darn it, can't use 'em as I can see." The stranger ran his arm down his waistcoat, and as if by a miracle of the buttons to which his empty sleeve pointed became undone. Then he said something about his shin and stooped down. He seemed to be fumbling with his shoes and socks. "Why," said Huckster suddenly, "that's not a man at all. It's just empty clothes. Look! You can see down his collar and the lining of his clothes." Huckster extended his hand. It seemed to meet something in midair, and he drew it back with a sharp exclamation. "I wish you'd keep your fingers out of my eye," said the aerial voice in a tone of savage expostulation. "The fact is, I'm all here, head, hands, legs, and all the rest of it, but it happens I'm invisible." Several other of the menfolks had now entered the room, so that it was closely crowded. "Invisible, eh?" said Huckster. "Who ever heard the likes of that? It's strange, perhaps, but it's not a crime. Why am I assaulted by a policeman in this fashion?" "Ah, that's a different matter," said Jaffers. "No doubt you are a bit difficult to see in this light, but I got a warrant and it's all correct. What I'm after ain't no invisibility, it's burglary. There's a house been broke into and money took." "Well?" "And circumstances certainly point—" "Stuff and nonsense," said the invisible man. "I hope so, sir, but I've got my instructions." "Well," said the stranger, "I'll come, but no handcuffs." "It's the regular thing," said Jaffers. "No handcuffs," stipulated the stranger. Abruptly, the figure sat down, and before anyone could realize what was being done, the slippers, socks, and trousers had been kicked off under the table. Then he sprang up again and flung off his coat. "Here, stop that," said Jaffers. "Hold him," said Jaffers loudly. "Once he gets the things off." "Hold him!" cried everyone, and there was a rush at the fluttering white shirt, which was now all that was visible of the stranger. The shirt sleeve planted a shrewd blow in Hall's face that stopped his open-armed advance, and in another moment the garment was lifted up and became convulsed and vacantly flapping about the arms, even as a shirt that is being thrust over a man's head. Jaffers clutched at it and only helped to pull it off. "Look out!" said everybody, fencing at random and hitting at nothing. "Hold him! Don't let him loose! Here he is!" Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once, and Sandy Wadgers, his wits sharpened by a frightful blow in the nose, reopened the door and led the rout. The others, following incontinently, were jammed for a moment in the corner by the doorway, and in another moment the whole mass of struggling men shot out into the crowded hall. "I got him!" shouted Jaffers. Men staggered right and left in the extraordinary conflict, swayed swiftly towards the house door, and went spinning down the steps of the inn. Jaffers cried in a strangled voice, spun around, and fell heavily undermost with his head on the gravel. Halfway across the road, a woman screamed as something pushed by her. A dog yelped and ran howling into Huckster's yard, and with that the transit of the invisible man was accomplished. For a space people stood amazed and gesticulating, and then came panic, and scattered them abroad through the village as a gust scatters dead leaves. But Jaffers lay quite still at the foot of the steps. Chapter 6. Mr. Thomas Marvel was sitting with his feet in a ditch by the roadside over the down toward Aberdeen, about 1.5 miles out of Iping. His feet were bare, and he was contemplating trying on a pair of boots. They were the soundest boots he had come across for a long time, but too large for him, whereas the ones he had were, in dry weather, a very comfortable fit, but too thin-soled for damp. So he put the 4 shoes in a graceful group on the turf and looked at them. And seeing them there among the grass and springing agrimony, it suddenly occurred to him that both pairs were exceedingly ugly to see. He was not at all startled by a voice behind him. "They're boots, anyhow," said the voice. "They are. Charity boots," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "I've worn worse. In fact, I've worn none. They're sound enough, of course, but a gentleman on tramp sees such a thundering lot of his boots. And a good country for boots, too, in a general way. But it's just my promiscuous luck. I've got my boots in this country 10 years or more, and then they treat you like this." "It's a beast of a country," said the voice, "and pigs for people." "Ain't it?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "Lord, but them boots! It beats it." He turned his head over his shoulder to the right to look at the boots of his interlocutor, and lo, where the boots of his interlocutor should have been, were neither legs nor boots. "Where are yer?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "Don't be alarmed," said a voice. "None of your ventriloquizing me," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, rising sharply to his feet. "Don't be alarmed," repeated the voice. "You'll be alarmed in a minute, you silly fool," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "Are you buried?" There was no answer. Mr. Thomas Marvel stood bootless and amazed. "So help me," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "You keep your nerves steady." Marvel remained staring about him, rotating slowly backwards. "I could have swore I heard a voice," he whispered. "Of course you did." "It's there again," said Mr. Marvel. He was suddenly taken by the collar and shaken violently. "Don't be a fool," said the voice. "I'm off my blooming chump," said Mr. Marvel. "It's no good. It's fretting about them blarsted boots. I'm off my blessed bloomin' chump, or its spirits." "Neither one thing nor the other," said the voice. "What else can you be?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "Very well," said the voice in a tone of relief. "Then I'm going to throw flints at you till you think differently." "But where are ye?" The voice made no answer. A flint came whizzing by, apparently out of the air, and missed Mr. Marvel's shoulder by a hair's breadth. Mr. Marvel, turning, saw a flint jerk up into the air, trace a complicated path, hang for a moment, and then fling at his feet with almost invisible rapidity. Mr. Thomas Marvel jumped a foot and howled aloud. Then he started to run, tripped over an unseen obstacle, and came head over heels into a sitting position. "Now," said the voice, "am I imagination?" Mr. Marvel, by way of reply, struggled to his feet and was immediately rolled over again. "If you struggle any more," said the voice, "I shall throw the flint at your head." "I don't understand it," said Marvel, sitting up. The third flint fell. "It's very simple," said the voice. "I'm an invisible man." "Tell us something I don't know," said Mr. Marvel, gasping with pain. "Where you've hid, how you do it, I don't know. I'm beat." "That's all," said the voice. "I'm invisible. That's what I want you to understand." "But whereabouts?" interrupted Mr. Marvel. "Here, 6 yards in front of you." "Oh, come, I ain't blind. You'll be telling me next you're just thin air. I'm not one of your ignorant tramps." "Yes, I am, thin air." "Ain't there any stuff to you?" "I am just a human being, solid, needing food and drink, but I'm invisible." "Let's have a hand of you," said Marvel, "if you are real." He felt the hand that had closed round his wrist with his disengaged fingers, and his fingers went timorously up the arm, patted a muscular chest, and explored a bearded face. "I'm dashed," he said. "Most remarkable. And there I can see a rabbit clean through you, 'arf a mile away. How'd you manage it? How the deuce is it done?" "It's too long a story, and besides—" "I tell you, the whole business fairly beats me," said Mr. Marvel. "What I want to say at present is this: I need help. I have come to that. I came upon you suddenly. I was wandering, mad with rage, naked, impotent. I could have murdered, and I saw you—" "Lord!" said Mr. Marvel. "I came up behind you, hesitated, went on." Mr. Marvel's expression was eloquent. "Then stopped. 'Here,' I said, 'is an outcast like myself. This is the man for me.' So I turned back and came to you. You. And—" "Lord!" said Mr. Marvel. "But I'm all in a tizzy. May I ask, how is it, and what you may be requiring in the way of help? Invisible!" "I want you to help me get clothes and shelter, and then with other things. I've left them long enough. If you won't, well, but you must." "Look here," said Mr. Marvel. "I'm too flabbergasted. Don't knock me about any more, and leave me go. I must get steady a bit. It's all so unreasonable. Nothing visible for miles except the bosom of nature. And then comes a voice, and stones, and a fist. Lord!" "Pull yourself together," said the voice, "for you have to do the job I've chosen for you." Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were round. "I've chosen you," said the voice. "You are the only man except some of those fools down there who knows there is such a thing as an invisible man. You have to be my helper. Help me, and I will do great things for you." "But if you betray me," he said, "if you fail to do as I direct you—" He paused and tapped Mr. Marvel's shoulder smartly. Mr. Marvel gave a yelp of terror at the touch. "I don't want to betray you," said Mr. Marvel, edging away from the direction of the fingers. "Just tell me what I got to do. Lord, whatever you want done, then I'm most willing to do." "If you try to give me the slip, I will kill you," said the voice. Chapter 7. In the early evening time, Dr. Kemp was sitting in his study on the hill overlooking Burdock. For a moment he sat admiring the rich golden color of the setting sun, and then his attention was attracted by the little figure of a man running over the hill brow towards him. He was running so fast that his legs verily twinkled. "Fool," said Kemp. "He seems in a confounded hurry, but he doesn't seem to be getting on. If his pockets were full of lead, he couldn't run heavier." But those who saw the fugitive nearer, and perceived the abject terror on his perspiring face, did not share in the doctor's contempt. He looked neither to the right nor the left, but his dilated eyes stared straight downhill to where the lamps were being lit, and the people were crowded in the street. All he passed stopped and began staring and interrogating one another with an inkling of discomfort for the reason of his haste. And then presently a dog playing in the road yelped and ran under a gate, and as they still wondered something, a sound like a panting breathing rushed by. People sprang off the pavement. It passed in shouts. It passed by instinct down the hill. They were shouting in the street before Marvel was halfway there. They were bolting into houses and slamming the doors behind them with the news. He heard it and made one last desperate spurt. Fear came striding by, rushed ahead of him, and in a moment had seized the town. "The Invisible Man is coming! The Invisible Man!" The Jolly Cricketers is just at the bottom of the hill. The barman leant his fat red arms on the counter, while a black-bearded man in gray snapped up biscuit and cheese and conversed with a policeman. "What's the shouting about?" said the cabman, as somebody ran by outside. "Fire, perhaps," said the barman. Footsteps approached the door, was pushed open violently, and Marvel, weeping and disheveled, rushed in, made a convulsive turn, and attempted to shut the door. It was held half open by a strap. "Coming!" he bawled. "He's coming! The Visible Man! For God's sake, help! Help!" "Shut the doors," said the policeman. "Who's coming?" He went to the door, released the strap, and it slammed. The barman closed the other door. "Let me go inside," said Marvel, staggering and weeping. "Lock me in somewhere. I tell you, he's after me. I give him the slip. He said he'd kill me, and he will." "The door's shut," said the man with the black beard. "What's it all about?" "Let me go inside," said Marvel, and shrieked aloud as a blow suddenly made the fastened door shiver and was followed by a shouting outside. "Hello!" cried the policeman. "Who's there?" Mr. Marvel began to make frantic dives at panels that looked like doors. "He'll kill me! He's got a knife or something!" "Here you are," said the barman. "Come in here." And he held up the flap of the bar. Mr. Marvel rushed behind the bar as the summons outside was repeated. "Don't open the door!" he screamed. "Where shall I hide?" The window of the inn was suddenly smashed in, and there was a screaming and running to and fro in the street. The barman stood in front of the bar parlor door, which was now locked on Mr. Marvel, stared at the smashed window, and came round to the two other men. Everything was suddenly quiet. "Draw the bolts," said the man with the black beard. He showed a revolver in his hand. "Come in," he said, standing back and facing the unbolted door with his pistol behind him. The door remained closed. "Good Lord," said the barman. "There's the back. Just watch them doors. I say—" He looked about him helplessly. The bar parlor door slammed, and they heard the key turn. "There's the yard door and the private door." He rushed out of the bar. In a minute he reappeared with a carving knife in his hand. "The yard door was open," he said. "He may be in the house now," said the first cabman. "He's not in the kitchen," said the barman. "There's two women there, and I've stabbed every inch of it with this little beef slicer. And they don't think he's come in. They haven't noticed." "Have you fastened it?" asked the first cabman. "I'm out of frocks," said the barman. The man with the beard replaced his revolver. And even as he did so, the flap of the bar was shut down and the bolt clicked. And then with a tremendous thud, the catch of the door snapped, and the bar parlor door burst open. They heard Marvel squeal like a caught leveret, and forthwith they were clambering over the bar to his rescue. The bearded man's revolver cracked, and the looking-glass at the back of the parlor starred and came smashing and tinkling down. As the barman entered the room, he saw Marvel struggling against the door that led to the yard and kitchen. The door flew open while the barman hesitated, and Marvel was dragged into the kitchen. Marvel, head down, was forced to the kitchen door, and the bolts were drawn. Then the policeman rushed in, followed by one of the cabmen. He gripped the wrist of the invisible man that collared Marvel, was hit in the face, and went reeling back. The door opened, and Marvel made a frantic effort to obtain a lodgment behind it. Then the cabman collared something. "I got him," said the cabman. The barman's hands came clawing at the unseen. Mr. Marvel suddenly dropped to the ground and made an attempt to crawl behind the legs of the fighting men. The voice of the invisible man yelped out sharply as the policeman trod on his foot. The door into the bar parlor from the kitchen slammed and covered Mr. Marvel's retreat. The men in the kitchen found themselves clutching at and struggling with empty air. "Where's he gone?" cried the bearded man. "This way," said the policeman, stepping into the yard. A piece of tile whizzed by his head and smashed among the crockery on the kitchen table. A steel barrel shone over the policeman's shoulder, and 5 bullets had followed one another into the twilight whence the missile had come. A silence followed. "Get a lantern, someone," said the bearded man, "and come and feel about for his body." Chapter 8. About an hour after the shots had been fired, Dr. Kemp's front doorbell rang. He had been writing slackly and with intervals of abstraction since the shots. He heard the servant answer the door and waited for her feet on the staircase, but she did not come. "Wonder what that was," said Dr. Kemp. He went downstairs from his study and called to the housemaid as she appeared in the hall below. "Was that a letter?" he asked. "Only a runaway ring, sir," she answered. "I'm restless tonight," he said to himself. He went back to his study. In a little while he was hard at work again. It was 2 o'clock before Dr. Kemp had finished his work for the night. He rose, yawned, and went downstairs to bed. He had already removed his coat and vest when he noticed that he was thirsty. He took a candle and went down to the dining room in search of a siphon and whiskey. As he recrossed the hall, he noticed a dark spot on the linoleum near the mat at the front of the stairs. He put down the siphon and whiskey and touched the spot. Without any great surprise, he found it had the stickiness and color of drying blood. He took up his burden again and returned upstairs, looking about him and trying to account for the blood spot. Then he saw that the door handle of his own room was blood-stained. He went straight into his room, his face quite calm, and his glance fell on the bed. On the counterpane was a mess of blood, and the sheet had been torn. On the further side, the bedclothes were depressed, as if someone had been recently sitting there. Then he thought he heard a low voice say, "Good heavens, Kemp!" Was that really a voice? Then he distinctly heard a movement across the room near the wash-hand stand, and an eerie feeling came upon him. He closed the door of the room, came forward to the dressing table, and put down his burdens. Suddenly he perceived a coiled and blood-stained bandage of linen rag hanging in mid-air between him and the wash-hand stand. He stared at this in amazement. It was a bandage properly tied, but quite empty. He would have advanced to grasp it, but a touch arrested him, and a voice speaking quite close to him. "Kemp," said the voice. "Eh?" said Kemp, with his mouth open. "Keep your nerve," said the voice. "I'm an invisible man." Kemp made no answer for a space. "Invisible man?" he said. "I am an invisible man," repeated the voice. The story he had been active to ridicule only that morning rushed through Kemp's brain. He did not appear to have been either very much frightened or very greatly surprised at the moment. "I thought it was all a lie," he said. "Have you a bandage on?" he asked. "Yes," said the invisible man. "Oh!" said Kemp, and then roused himself. He stepped forward suddenly, and his hand, extended towards the bandage, met invisible fingers. He recoiled at the touch, and his color changed. "Kemp, for God's sake! I want help badly! Stop!" The hand gripped his arm. He struck at it. "Kemp, keep steady!" And the grip tightened. A frantic desire to free himself took possession of Kemp. The hand of the bandaged arm gripped his shoulder, and he was suddenly tripped and flung backwards upon the bed. "Listen to reason, will you?" said the invisible man. "By heaven, you'll madden me in a minute." Kemp struggled for another moment and then lay still. "If you shout, I'll smash your face," said the invisible man, relieving his mouth. "I'm an invisible man. It's no foolishness and no magic. And I need your help. I don't want to hurt you, but if you behave like a frantic rustic, I must. Don't you remember me, Kemp? Griffin, of University College?" "Let me get up," said Kemp. "I'll stop where I am, and let me sit quiet for a minute." He sat up and felt his neck. "I am Griffin, of University College, and I have made myself invisible. I am just an ordinary man, a man you have known." "Griffin?" said Kemp. "I am confused," said Kemp. "What has this to do with Griffin?" "I am Griffin." Kemp thought. "It's horrible," he said. "But what devilry must happen to make a man invisible?" "It's no devilry. It's a process, sane and intelligible enough." "It's horrible," said Kemp. "How on earth—" "Great God! Kemp, you are a man. Take it steady. Give me some food and drink, and let me sit down here." Kemp stared at the bandage as it moved across the room, then saw a basket chair dragged across the floor and come to rest near the bed. It creaked, and the seat was depressed. He rubbed his eyes and felt his neck again. "This beats ghosts," he said, and laughed stupidly. "That's better. Thank heaven, you're getting sensible. Give me some whiskey. I'm near dead." "It didn't feel so. Where are you? If I get up, shall I run into you? There, all right. Here. Where shall I give it to you?" The chair creaked, and Kemp felt the glass drawn away from him. It came to rest, poised 20 inches above the front edge of the seat of the chair. He stared at it in infinite perplexity. "This must be hypnotism. You have suggested you are invisible." "This is no hypnotism. Listen to me. I'm starving," said the voice, "and the night is chilly to a man without clothes." "Food?" said Kemp. The tumbler of whiskey tilted itself. "Yes," said the Invisible Man, wrapping it down. "Have you a dressing gown?" Kemp walked to a wardrobe and produced a robe of dingy scarlet. "This do?" he asked. It was taken from him. It hung limp for a moment in mid-air, fluttered weirdly, stood full and decorous, buttoning itself, and sat down in his chair. "Drawers, socks, slippers would be a comfort," said the Unseen curtly, "and food." Kemp turned out his drawers for the articles, and then went downstairs. He came back with some cold cutlets and bread, and placed them before his guest. Soon he saw a cutlet hung in mid-air with a sound of gnawing. "Invisible," said Kemp, and sat down on a bedroom chair. "I suppose that wrist is all right." "Trust me," said the Invisible Man. "It's odd that I should blunder into your house to get my bandaging. My first stroke of luck. Anyhow, I meant to sleep in this house tonight. You must stand that. It's a filthy nuisance, my blood showing, isn't it? Quite a clot over there. Gets visible as it coagulates, I see. It's only the living tissue I've changed, and only for as long as I'm alive. I've been in the house 3 hours." "But how's it done?" began Kemp. "Confound it! The whole business is unreasonable from beginning to end." "Quite reasonable," said the Invisible Man. "What were the shots?" Kemp asked. "How did the shooting begin?" "There was a real fool of a man who tried to steal my money. Has done so." He continued, "I'm lucky to have fallen upon you, Kemp. You must help me. The things I have been through." He helped himself to more whiskey and soda. "How did you get like this?" Kemp asked. "Let me rest for a little while and I will tell you." But the story was not told that night. The Invisible Man was exhausted, and his mind came round to brood upon his chase down the hill and the struggle about the inn. He spoke in fragments of marvel. His voice grew angry. Kemp tried to gather what he could. "He was afraid of me," said the Invisible Man. "He meant to give me the slip. He was always casting about." He groaned suddenly. "Kemp," he said, "I've had no sleep for near 3 days. I must sleep soon." "Well, have this room." "But if I sleep, he will get away." "Ugh! What does it matter?" "What's the shot wound?" asked Kemp abruptly. "Nothing. Scratch and blood. Oh, God, how I want sleep." "Why not?" The Invisible Man appeared to be regarding Kemp. "Because I've a particular objection to being caught by my fellow men," he said slowly. Kemp started. "Fool that I am," said the Invisible Man. "I put the idea into your head." The Invisible Man refused to accept Kemp's word that his freedom should be respected. He examined the 2 windows of the bedroom, drew up the blinds, and opened the sashes to confirm Kemp's statement that a retreat by them would be possible. Then he examined the keys of the bedroom and the 2 dressing-room doors to satisfy himself that these also could be made an assurance of freedom. Finally, he expressed himself satisfied. "I'm sorry," said the Invisible Man, "that I cannot tell you all that I have done tonight, but I am worn out. It's grotesque, no doubt, but believe me, Kemp, it is quite a possible thing. But tomorrow. Now, Kemp, I feel as though I must sleep or perish. It's incredible, but it's real." "Is there anything more I can get you?" asked Kemp. "Only bid me good night," said Griffin. "Good night," said Kemp, who started to the door. Suddenly the dressing-gown walked quickly towards him. "Understand me. No attempts to hamper me." Kemp's face changed a little. "I thought I gave you my word," he said. Kemp closed the door behind him, and the key was turning upon him forthwith. Kemp slapped his brow with his hand. "Am I dreaming? Has the world gone mad, or have I?" He shook his head hopelessly, turned, and went downstairs to his little consulting room and lit the gas there. He caught up the morning's paper and read the account of a strange story from Iping. Kemp read it swiftly. "Good heavens," said Kemp, reading eagerly an incredulous account of the events. He dropped the paper and stared blankly in front of him. Probably a fabrication. He caught up the paper again and reread the whole business. Why the deuce was he chasing a tramp? He sat down abruptly on the surgical bench. "He's not only invisible," he said, "but he's mad." When dawn came, Kemp was still pacing up and down, trying to grasp the incredible. His servants discovered him, and he gave them instructions to lay breakfast for 2 in the study, and then to confine themselves to the basement and ground floor. Then he continued to pace the dining room until the paper came. That had much to say and little to tell beyond the confirmation of the evening before. This gave Kemp the essence of the happenings at the Jolly Cricketers, and the name of Marvel. Certain minor facts were added to the Iping story, but there was nothing to throw light on the connection between the Invisible Man and the tramp. for Mr. Marvel had supplied no information about the 3 books or the money with which he was lined. "He is invisible," Kemp said, "and it reads like rage growing to mania. The things he may do! And he's upstairs free as the air. What on earth ought I to do?" He went to a desk in the corner and began a note. Then he took an envelope and addressed it to Colonel 80, Port Burdock, and directed a servant to deliver it. The invisible man awoke even as Kemp was doing this. Chapter 10. "All the facts are out about you," said Kemp as he entered the bedroom. "The world has become aware of its invisible citizen. I don't know what your plans are, but of course I'm anxious to help you." The invisible man sat down on the bed. "There's breakfast upstairs," said Kemp, and he was delighted to find his strange guest rose willingly. "Before we can do anything else," said Kemp, "I must understand a little more about this invisibility of yours." He had sat down after one nervous glance out of the window. "It's simple enough and credible enough," said Griffin. "No doubt to you, but—" Kemp laughed. "Well, yes, to me it seemed wonderful at first, no doubt, but now—" He paused, and his attitude suggested a roving glance at the window. "How did you get to Iping?" said Kemp, anxious to keep his guest busy talking. "I went there to work. I had one hope. I have it still, a way of getting back, of restoring what I have done when I choose, when I have done all I mean to do invisibly, and that is what I chiefly want to talk to you about now." "You went straight to Iping?" "Yes. I had simply to get my 3 volumes of memoranda and checkbook, my luggage and underclothing, order a quantity of chemicals to work out this idea of mine, and then I started. By heaven, Kemp, you don't know what rage is. To have worked for years, to have planned and plotted, and then to get some fumbling, purblind idiot messing across your course. Every conceivable sort of silly creature that has ever been created has been sent to cross me. If I have much more of it, I shall go wild. I shall start mowing 'em. As it is, they've made things 1,000 times more difficult. No doubt it's exasperating," said Kemp dryly. Chapter 11. "But now," said Kemp, with a side glance out of the window, "what are we to do?" He moved nearer his guest as he spoke in such a manner as to prevent the possibility of a sudden glimpse of the 3 men who were advancing up the hill road. "What were you planning to do when you were heading for Port Burdock? Had you any plan?" "I was going to clear out of the country. My idea was to get aboard a steamer for France, and then go by train into Spain, or else get to Algiers. But I have altered that plan rather since seeing you. I was using that tramp as a money box and luggage carrier until I decided how to get my books and things sent over to meet me. And then the filthy brute must needs try and rob me. He has hidden my books, Kemp. If I can lay my hands on him— Best plan to get the books out of him first. But where is he? Do you know?" "He's in the town police station, locked up, by his own request." "Cur," said the invisible man. "But that hangs up your plans a little. We must get those books." "Certainly," said Kemp, a little nervously, wondering if he heard the footsteps outside. He tried to think of something to keep the talk going, but the invisible man resumed of his own accord. "Blundering into your house, Kemp, changes all my plans. You have told no one I am here?" he asked abruptly. Kemp hesitated. "Not a soul." "Ah, now," the invisible man stood up, began to pace the study. "I made a mistake, Kemp, in carrying this thing through alone. I have wasted strength, time, opportunities. What I want, Kemp, is a helper and a hiding place, an arrangement whereby I can sleep and eat and rest in peace. This invisibility, in fact, is only good in 2 cases. It's useful in getting away. It's useful in approaching. It's particularly useful, therefore, in killing. I can walk round a man, whatever weapon he has, choose my point, strike as I like, dodge as I like, escape as I like." Kemp's hand went to his mustache. Was that a movement downstairs? "And it is killing we must do, Kemp." "It is killing we must do," repeated Kemp. "I'm listening to your plan, Griffin, but I'm not agreeing, mind. Why killing? Not wanton killing, but a judicious slaying. The point is, they know there is an invisible man. And that invisible man, Kemp, must now establish a reign of terror. He must take some town like your Burdock and terrify and dominate it, and all who disobey his orders he must kill." "Humph!" said Kemp, no longer listening to Griffin, but to the sound of his front door opening and closing. "It seems to me, Griffin," he said to cover his wandering attention, "that I would be in a difficult position." "No one would know," said the invisible man eagerly, and then suddenly, "Hush! "What's that downstairs?" "Nothing," said Kemp, and suddenly began to speak loud and fast. "I don't agree to this, Griffin," he said. "Understand me, I don't agree to this. Why dream of playing a game against the race? Don't be a lone wolf. Publish your results. Take the world into your confidence. Think what you might do with 1,000,000 helpers." The Invisible Man interrupted, arm extended. "There are footsteps coming upstairs," he said in a low voice. "Nonsense," said Kemp. "Let me see," said the Invisible Man, and advanced to the door. And then things happened very swiftly. Kemp hesitated for a second, and then moved to intercept him. The Invisible Man started. "Traitor!" cried the voice, and suddenly the dressing gown opened, and sitting down, the unseen began to disrobe. Kemp made 3 swift steps to the door, and forthwith the Invisible Man sprang to his feet with a shout. Kemp flung the door open. As it opened, there came a sound of hurrying feet downstairs and voices. With a quick movement, Kemp thrust the Invisible Man back, sprang aside, and slammed the door. The key was outside and ready. In another moment, Griffin would have been alone in the study, a prisoner, save for one little thing. The key had been slipped in hastily that morning. As Kemp slammed the door, it fell to the floor. Kemp's face became white. He tried to grip the door handle with both hands. For a moment he stood lugging. Then the door gave 6 inches, but he got it closed again. The second time it was jerked a foot wide, and the dressing gown came wedging itself into the opening. His throat was gripped by invisible fingers, and he left his hold on the handle to defend himself. He was forced back, tripped, and pitched heavily into the corner of the landing. The empty dressing gown was flung on the top of him. Halfway up the staircase was Colonel Adie. He was staring aghast at the extraordinary sight of clothing tossing empty in the air. He saw Kemp felled and struggling to his feet. He saw him rush forward and go down again, felled like an ox. Then suddenly he was struck violently. A vast weight, it seemed, leapt upon him, and he was hurled headlong down the staircase. An invisible foot trod on his back. A ghostly patter passed downstairs. He heard the 2 police officers in the hall shout and run, and the front door of the house slammed violently. He rolled over and sat up staring. He saw, staggering down the staircase, Kemp, his lip bleeding. "My God!" cried Kemp. "The game's up. He's gone." Chapter 12. For a space, Kemp was too inarticulate to make Adie understand what had just happened. They stood on the landing, Kemp speaking swiftly. But presently Adie began to grasp something of the situation. "He is mad," said Kemp. "He thinks of nothing but his own advantage. He has wounded men. He will kill them unless we can prevent him. He is going out now, furious." "He must be caught," said Adie. "That is certain." "You must begin at once," cried Kemp. "You must prevent his leaving this district. Once he gets away, he may go through the countryside as he wishes, killing and maiming. And you must prevent him from eating or sleeping. Food must be locked up and secured. The houses everywhere must be barred against him. I tell you, Adie, unless he is pinned and secured, it is frightful to think of the things that may happen." "I must go to the central station at once and begin organizing," said Adie. "Get dogs," said Kemp. "They don't see him, but they wind him. And you must keep on beating, every thicket, every quiet corner, and put all weapons, all implements that might be weapons, away." "Good again," said Adie. "We shall have him yet." The Invisible Man seemed to have rushed out of Kemp's house in a state of blind fury. Vanished from human ken about midday, and no living witness can tell what he did until about 2:30. It was a fortunate thing, perhaps, for humanity, but for him it was a fatal inaction. During that time, a growing multitude of men were busy organizing. In a great circle of 20 miles round Port Burdock, men armed with guns and bludgeons were presently setting out in groups of 3 and 4, with dogs, to beat the roads and fields. Kemp's proclamation was posted over almost the whole district by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It gave all the conditions of the struggle, the necessity of keeping the Invisible Man from food and sleep, the necessity for incessant watchfulness, and for a prompt attention to any evidence of his movements. That afternoon, the Invisible Man must have learnt something of the rapid use Kemp had made of his confidences. He must have found houses locked and secured. No doubt he read the proclamations and realized something of the nature of the campaign against him. And as the evening advanced, the fields became dotted with groups of 3 or 4 men and noisy with the yelping of dogs. For nearly 24 hours he was a hunted man. In the night he must have eaten and slept, For in the morning he was himself again, active, powerful, and angry, prepared for his last great struggle against the world. Chapter 13. That morning Kemp read a strange missive, written in pencil on a greasy sheet of paper. "You have been amazingly energetic and clever," this letter ran, "though what you stand to gain by it I cannot imagine. For a whole day you have chased, but I have had food in spite of you. I have slept in spite of you, and the game is only beginning. This announces the first day of the terror. Port Burdock is no longer under the Queen. It is under me, the Terror. This is day one of year one of the new epoch, the epoch of the Invisible Man. To begin with, the rule will be easy. The first day there will be one execution for the sake of example, a man named Kemp. Death starts for him today." Kemp read this letter twice. "It's no hoax," he said. "That's his voice, and he means it." He got up slowly, leaving his lunch unfinished, and went into his study. He rang for his housekeeper and told her to examine all the fastenings of the windows and close all the shutters. From a locked drawer in his bedroom, he took a little revolver and put it into the pocket of his jacket. He wrote a number of notes, one to Colonel Adie, gave them to his servant to take, with explicit instructions as to her way of leaving the house. "There is no danger," he said. He remained meditative for a space after doing this, and then returned to his cooling lunch. He ate with gaps of thought. Finally he struck the table sharply. "We will have him," he said, "and I am the bait. He will come too far." He went up to the study, carefully shutting every door after him. He stood at the window staring at the hot hillside. "He may be watching me now." He went close to the window. Something rapped smartly against the brickwork over the frame and made him start violently back. "I'm getting nervous," said Kemp. Presently he heard the front doorbell ringing and hurried downstairs. He unbolted and unlocked the door, examined the chain, put it up, and opened cautiously without showing himself. A familiar voice hailed him. It was Adie. "Your servant's been assaulted, Kemp," he said round the door. "What?" exclaimed Kemp. "Had that note of yours taken away from her. He's close about here. Let me in." Kemp released the chain, and Adie entered. He stood in the hall, looking with infinite relief at Kemp refastening the door. "Note was snatched out of her hand. Scared her horribly. He's close here. What was it about?" "Look here," said Kemp, and led the way into his study. He handed Adie the Invisible Man's letter. Adie read it and whistled softly. "And you?" said Adie. "Proposed a trap, like a fool," said Kemp, "and sent my proposal out by a maidservant, to him." "He'll clear out," said Adie. "Not he," said Kemp. A resounding smash of glass came from upstairs. Adie had a silvery glimpse of a little revolver half out of Kemp's pocket. "It's a window, upstairs," said Kemp, and led the way up. There came a second smash while they were still on the staircase. When they reached the study, they found 2 of the 3 windows smashed, half the room littered with splintered glass, and one big flint lying on the writing table. The 2 men stopped in the doorway. Then a snap like a pistol hung starred for a moment and collapsed into the room. "What's this for?" said Adie. "It's a beginning," said Kemp. Then smash, and then whack of boards hit hard came from downstairs. "Confound him!" said Kemp. "That must be... Yes, it's one of the bedrooms. He's going to do all the house, but he's a fool. The shutters are up, and the glass will fall outside. He'll cut his feet." The 2 men stood on the landing perplexed. "I have it," said Adie. "Let me have a stick or something, and I'll go down to the station and get the bloodhounds put on. That ought to settle him." Another window went the way of its fellows. "You haven't a revolver?" asked Adie. Kemp's hand went to his pocket. Then he hesitated. "I haven't one, at least to spare." "I'll bring it back," said Adie. "You'll be safe here." Kemp, ashamed of his momentary lapse from truthfulness, handed him the weapon. "Now for the door," said Adie. As they stood hesitating in the hall, they heard one of the first-floor bedroom windows crack and clash. Kemp went to the door and began to slip the bolts as silently as possible. His face was a little paler than usual. "You must step straight out," said Kemp. In another moment, Adie was on the doorstep, and the bolts were dropping back into the staples. He hesitated for a moment, then he marched down the steps. He crossed the lawn and approached the gate. A little breeze seemed to ripple over the grass. "Stop a bit," said a voice, and Adie stopped dead, and his hand tightened on the revolver. "Well?" said Adie, and every nerve tense. "Oblige me by going back to the house," said the voice. "Sorry," said Adie, a little hoarsely. The voice was on his left front, he thought. Suppose he were to take his luck with a shot. "What are you going for?" said the voice. Adie desisted and thought. "Where I go," he said slowly, "is my own business." The words were still on his lips when an arm came round his neck, his back felt a knee, and he was sprawling backward. He drew clumsily and fired absurdly, and in another moment he was struck in the mouth and the revolver wrested from his grip. He tried to struggle up and fell back. The voice laughed. "I'd kill you now if it wasn't the waste of a bullet," it said. He saw the revolver in midair, 6 feet off, covering him. "Well?" said Adie. "Get up," said the voice. "Attention," said the voice, and then fiercely, "Don't try any games. You've got to go back to the house." "He won't let me in," said Adie. "That's a pity," said the invisible man. "I've got no quarrel with you." "What am I to do?" asked the invisible man. "You will get help. The only thing is for you to go back." "I will try. If he lets me in, will you promise not to rush the door?" "I've got no quarrel with you," said the voice. Kemp had hurried upstairs after letting Adie out, and now, crouching among the broken glass and peering cautiously over the edge of the study window-sill, he saw Adie stand parleying with the unseen. "Why doesn't he fire?" whispered Kemp to himself. Then the revolver moved a little, and the glint of the sunlight flashed in Kemp's eyes. He shaded his eyes and tried to see the source of the blinding beam. "Surely," he said, "Adie has given up the revolver." Adie turned towards the house, walking slowly with his hands behind him. Kemp watched him, puzzled. The revolver vanished, flashed again into sight, vanished again, and became evident on a closer scrutiny as a little dark object following Adie. Then things happened very quickly. Adie leapt backwards, swung around, clutched at this little object, missed it, threw up his hands, and fell forward on his face, leaving a little puff of blue in the air. Kemp did not hear the sound of the shot. Adie fell forward and lay still. Adie lay on the lawn near the gate. Kemp scrutinized the surroundings of the house for a glimpse of the revolver, but it had vanished. Kemp sat listening and then began peering cautiously out of the 3 windows, one after another. He armed himself with his bedroom poker and went to examine the interior fastenings of the ground-floor windows again. He returned to the study. Coming very slowly along the road by the villas were the housemaid and 2 policemen. He wondered what his antagonist was doing. There was a smash from below. He hesitated and went downstairs again. Suddenly, the house resounded with heavy blows and the splintering of wood. He turned the key and opened the kitchen door. As he did so, the shutters, split and splintering, came flying inward. The shutters had been driven in with an axe, and now the axe was descending in sweeping blows upon the window frame and the iron bars defending it. Then suddenly it leapt aside and vanished. He saw the revolver lying on the path outside, and then the little weapon sprang into the air. He dodged back. The revolver cracked just too late, and a splinter from the edge of the closing door flashed over his head. He slammed and locked the door, and as he stood outside he heard Griffin shouting and laughing. Then the blows of the axe with its splitting and smashing consequences were resumed. Suddenly the house was full of the invisible man's resounding blows on the kitchen. Chapter 14. The shutters of the drawing-room window were flung open violently, and Kemp sprang from the window and began running along a side path. Emerging into the hill road, Kemp naturally took the downward direction. The hill road was indescribably vast and desolate, and that the beginnings of the town far below were strangely remote, though he could see people down below were stirring. A tram was just arriving at the hill foot. Was that footsteps he heard behind him? Beyond the tram were posts and heaps of gravel. The tram driver and his helper stood staring at Kemp. Further on, the astonished features of navvies appeared above the mounds of gravel. Kemp could hear the invisible man's footsteps not far behind him. "The invisible man!" he cried to the navvies, and by an inspiration leapt the excavation and turned into a little side street, and then made for the mouth of an alley that ran back into the main hill street again. Immediately he became aware of a tumultuous vociferation and running people. Hardly a dozen yards off ran a huge navvy, slashing viciously with a spade, and hard behind him came the tram conductor with his fists clenched. Up the street, others followed these two, striking and shouting, "Spread out! Spread out!" Kemp suddenly grasped the altered condition of the chase. He stopped and looked round, panting. "He's close here!" he cried. "Form a line across!" He was hit hard under the ear and went reeling, but managed to keep his feet. Then he was hit again under the jaw and sprawled headlong on the ground. Then a knee compressed his diaphragm, and a couple of eager hands gripped his throat. He grasped the wrists, and then the spade of the navvy came whirling through the air above him and struck something with a dull thud. The grip at his throat suddenly relaxed, and with a convulsive effort, Kemp loosed himself, grasped a limp shoulder, and rolled uppermost. He gripped the unseen elbows near the ground. "I've got him!" screamed Kemp. "Help! Help! Hold!" Then a dozen hands gripped, clutched, and tore at the unseen. The tram conductor suddenly got the neck and shoulders and lugged him back. Down went the heap of struggling men again and rolled over. Then suddenly a wild scream of "Mercy! Mercy!" that died down swiftly to a sound like choking. "Get back!" cried Kemp, and there was a vicious shoving back of stalwart forms. There was a brief struggle to clear a space, and then the circle of eager faces saw the doctor kneeling and holding invisible arms to the ground. Behind him a constable gripped invisible ankles. "Don't you leave go of him," cried the big navvy, holding a blood-stained spade. "He's shamming." "He's not shamming," said the doctor, "and I'll hold him." He released one hand and seemed to be feeling at the face. "The mouth's all wet," he said, and then, "Good God!" He knelt down by the side of the thing unseen. People now were coming out of the houses. Kemp felt about, his hand seeming to pass through empty air. "He's not breathing," he said. Suddenly, an old woman, peering under the arm of the big navvy, screamed sharply. "Looky there!" she said. And looking where she pointed, everyone saw, faint and transparent as though it was made of glass, the outline of a hand. It grew clouded and opaque even as they stared. "Hullo!" cried the constable. "Here's his feet a-showin'!" And so, slowly, that strange change continued. It was like the slow spreading of a poison. Presently they could see his crushed chest and his shoulders and the dim outline of his drawn and battered features. When at last Kemp stood up, there lay the bruised and broken body of a young man about 30. His hands were clenched, his eyes wide open, and his expression was one of anger and dismay. "Cover his face," said a man. "For heaven's sake, cover that face." Someone brought a sheet from the Jolly Cricketers, and having covered him, they carried him into that house. And there it was, on a shabby bed in a tawdry bedroom, surrounded by a crowd of ignorant and excited people, that Griffin, the most gifted physicist the world has ever seen, ended in infinite disaster his strange and terrible career as a broken, wounded, and betrayed man.